Hi everyone. Evidence-based history clearly told. When you hear "I will fight no more forever," do you read tragedy strategy or both? Which translation best captures its spirit? Comment your thoughts. Early October 1877. Snow flurries sweep the low ridges and coulees of the Bear Paw Mountains in north-central Montana as a moving village of Nimiipuu, also called Nez Perce, halts under distant rifle fire. For 4 months, families and horse herds have traveled from the Wallowa Valley across the Clearwater country over the Low Trail through Yellowstone and onto the plains. United States Army columns close from different directions. The village stands a short ride from the medicine line with Canada, yet the ground ahead is broken and the weather turns hard. The principal actors are clear. Among the Nimiipuu are leaders known in United States records as Joseph Looking-Glass White Bird, and others whose counsel has kept the camp together through long marches and sharp fights. Among United States commanders are Nelson Miles, advancing from Fort Keogh, and Oliver Howard, converging after a pursuit that began far to the southwest. Scouts, interpreters, and couriers link these forces across open country, but delays and frost lengthen every mile. The question is direct. What led these people to this ground in this season, and why did the words attributed to Joseph after the siege echo far beyond the Bear Paw uplands? This episode matters because it binds treaty geography to lived movement, because it demonstrates how a civilian camp under pressure can resist regular troops across mountain and plain, and because the surrender phrasing entered schoolbooks, newspapers, and public speech while the community endured captivity and forced relocation. This film fixes the time-place, and names follows the path from the 1855 recognition through the 1863 reduction and the 1877 deadlines, and traces the final encirclement at Bear Paw. It keeps a neutral archivist voice, uses short-sourced quotations, and returns to the record. The people continue today in Idaho and Washington, and the ground at Bear Paw remains a place of memory. The path to Bear Paw begins with treaties and the geography they attempted to draw on paper. In 1855, at Wallowa, a treaty recognized a broad Nimiipuu homeland across river valleys and plateaus in what is now the interior northwest. The map that followed left the Wallowa Valley within that homeland, as Nimiipuu leaders understood it. In 1863, a second treaty reduced the recognized area and excluded Wallowa. Some bands signed the new instrument under pressure. Other leaders who had not agreed to the reduction remained in their valleys, citing the earlier recognition and the continuity of their use. From that division came years of dispute that agency letters would later call the non-treaty question. Administrative shifts shaped the ground. After the Civil War, federal policy tilted toward the Interior Department's peace policy, with church-nominated agents, while the War Department remained responsible for force when local violence rose. At Lapwai, agency officials tried to gather census lists, issue annuity goods, and encourage resettlement inside the reduced lines. Stock grazing, fencing, and new roads introduced conflicts that earlier understandings had not resolved. Settler flows increased under homestead entries and mining booms along the Clearwater and Salmon. Freight wagons and stage lines cut predictable corridors. Telegraph wires reached posts in towns, speeding reports but not eliminating distance. Farther east, the decline of the buffalo and the rise of cattle and rail lines signaled a continental shift in resource use that also touched Nimiipuu trade networks. Through the early 1870s, Nimiipuu leaders pursued accommodation where possible and resisted removal from Wallowa. Visits to Lapwai, talks with Army officers, and efforts to keep peace with new neighbors appear in scattered agency notes. Yet, each season brought more pressure. Surveyors advanced and merchants recorded accounts that implied a future of fixed boundaries and new debts. Winter shortages and the uneven delivery of rations sharpened grievances. School regimes and rules about movement under agency passes marked a cultural turn that elders read as an attempt to end seasonal rounds and redirect young people away from language and ceremony. The immediate trigger developed in the spring of 1877, when deadlines were set for the non-treaty bands to enter the reservation. Notices were carried by interpreters. and passed along by couriers. Some families began to gather herds for a move, while others delayed hoping for a new talk or a line that would allow Wallowa residents. Local arrests and efforts to disarm men on the trail raised fear. In June, a killing near Salmon River set off reprisals. What might have been a local case moved suddenly onto a wider stage. At White Bird Canyon, a fight opened between United States troops and Nimiipuu fighters. Once blood was shed in quantity, the prospects for a negotiated pause diminished. Each side defined objectives within constraints that the terrain and season enforced. For the Nimiipuu non-treaty bands under leaders known in Army records as Joseph Looking-Glass Whitebird and others, the aim was to protect families and herds, avoid encirclement, and if possible reach a safe ground where talk could resume without disarmament under guard. Ammunition stores were finite and varied by household. Powder horns and cartridge boxes could not be refilled on the open trail, except through capture or trade. Food moved on the hoof and on pack animals and could be lost in a sudden skirmish. Horses required grazing and rest. The very strength of the village in numbers created a need for space and time that tactical skill alone could not supply. For United States commanders, the aim was to enforce the 1863 framework, prevent alliance with other nations to the east and north, and keep the civilian frontier from panic. Field columns formed from posts including Fort Wallowa, Fort Leavenworth, and Missoula to push the moving village toward a final decision. Later in the chase, Colonel Nelson Miles moved from Fort Keogh to cut the line to Canada. Telegraph linked headquarters to depots and newspapers, but mountain trails and high parks forced riders to carry the last facts by hand. Crow Scouts and other auxiliaries joined at points along the route to guide across broken country. Wagons carried rations and cartridge boxes but could not always keep pace. Casualty reports, requisitions for shoes and blankets, and pleas for fresh mounts trace a logistics picture under strain. Across July and August, the pursuit and the flight crossed the Clearwater and the Lolo Trail into Yellowstone country. Geyser basins and narrow canyons funneled movement. Tourists and civilian guides encountered scouts and sent accounts forward, some accurate and some confused. The campaign became a chain of sightings instead of a fixed front. The weather gave brief relief, and then turned with early cold hints in the high ground. By September, the line of march angled toward the Milk River country and the high land called Bear Paw. The medicine line lay beyond, close enough to imagine, far enough to demand one more calculated risk. Deadlines that began as agency rules had turned into dates of contact measured by miles and by the endurance of families under pressure. The stage was set for a final encirclement, shaped as much by supply and season as by orders and courage. The first decisive rise in pressure came in mid-July 1877 along the Clearwater in present-day Idaho. After the clash at White Bird Canyon, United States forces under Oliver Howard moved up the river corridors to force a crossing and break the moving Nimiipuu village. On 1877, 0711 and 1877, 0712. Sharp fighting flared near timbered benches and gravel bars where the river braided and turned. The Nimiipuu non-treaty bands used ground, carefully placing riflemen in broken rock and among cottonwood shadows, while families and horse herds slipped back into cover. Heat held over the valley in the afternoon, and dust rose in sheets behind any gallop. The telegraph carried reports from Leavenworth to posts to the west, but the fight itself ran on couriers' hand signals and the slow push of men on foot across stones slick with spray. When the shooting ceased, the village had not been trapped. It moved upslope toward ridges that pointed east. The army column counted its wounded and gathered rations for another chase. River water-cooled gun barrels laid out in the shade. The next incident shifted the campaign from a line to a field of choices. In late July, the Nimiipuu crossed high country along the Lolo Trail into present-day Montana. Captain Charles Rawn set a small barrier near Lolo with local volunteers and a short line of logs. Contemporary accounts later called the position Fort Fizzle. The barrier could not stop an organized movement that sought not a set-piece battle but safe passage with families. Talks failed in the heat and dust. scouts watched for flanking parties. When the village moved, it did so with discipline and speed. The barrier was bypassed through timber and steep draws. In the log of the nearest telegraph office, there was a brief flurry of traffic to Missoula and posts beyond, then silence, as riders went into the hills where the wire could not follow. The moral effect mattered. Settler communities heard that the column had not closed the road. The Army read that the chase had lengthened from days to weeks. On 1877, 0809, and the cold dawn of 1877, 0810, the campaign's temperature changed on the Big Hole River in present-day southwestern Montana. Under John Gibbon, United States troops struck a sleeping Nimiipuu camp tucked in willow and meadow near the water. The first volleys tore canvas and flesh. Women and children ran for the brush and for shallow channels that hid them only partly as smoke thickened. The Nimiipuu rallied fast. Rifle fire from the far bank and from low rises turned the attack into a fight for survival. The ground became a tangle of pits scraped by hands and knives of fallen horses and of gear scattered in panic or seized in defense. Casualties were heavy relative to numbers on both sides. The emotional effect was worse. From this point, any hope that negotiations could proceed without fear of sudden assault diminished. Surviving families spiked their pace and tightened flank guards. Soldiers marched on after burying their dead and sending wounded back by litter and wagon. Along the telegraph road, news jumped station to station, growing spare and hard in language with each relay. The campaign did not slow. In the dark hours of 1877, 0820 at Camas Meadows, on the edge of open sage and lava flows, Nimiipuu fighters struck the United States pack train that served Howard's column. Mule strings scattered in confusion. Loads spilled across brush and cinders. In the morning light, soldiers picked through torn sacks and counted missing animals. The hit did not annihilate the column, but it tore hours from the schedule and took the edge off pursuit. The incident proved that the moving village could choose the time and place for a blow that would echo down a week of marching. It also showed how thin any column ran when strung out across rough country. The wire could carry requests for fresh animals and appeals for local assistance. It could not conjure forage in a burned basin where hooves cut a haze of ash. Late August and early September carried the campaign into Yellowstone. Steam rose from ground in the morning cold. Elk watched from tree lines. The Nimiipuu moved through basins and along narrow paths crowded with tourists and guides who wrote what they saw and sometimes what they imagined into notebooks and letters. These accounts joined formal reports and passed by telegraph to posts on the plains. The presence of civilians made every movement a rumor, then a story, then an operation in the minds of commanders who wanted a firm line and found only moving points. Scouts for both sides read tracks along pumice and meadow and reported water levels and grass along the way out. In this stretch, the campaign felt less like a chase and more like a migration under fire. Every stop risked contact. Every night asked the sentries for another hour against fatigue under skies that flickered with early frost. By mid-September, the pressure found form again in open country. On 1877, 0913 near Canyon Creek in present-day Montana, a United States cavalry force under Samuel Sturgis closed fast on dust clouds that marked the Nimiipuu horse herd. The plan was to cut the herd, stampede it, and leave the village on foot within reach of encirclement. The ground was deceptive. Broken ridges and ravines offered firing positions to riders who knew how to dismount and use cover. Wind shifted and gusted, blowing smoke and dust into faces at the wrong moments. Attempts to seize the herd met counterfire from skirmishers who shot, remounted, and moved again. Couriers dashed with halters and shouted to boys turning horses into a tight body that could be driven north. The herd largely escaped. The village bled time and energy, but kept its mobility. For the United States Command, the failure to seize the horses meant that the last phase would still have to be a fight rather than a roundup. One field record from the pursuit captured the narrowing space between movement and entrapment. Samuel D. Sturgis, Field Report excerpt, near Canyon Creek, 1877, 0914. We pressed the herd at daylight and found the country broken in folds and channels. Dust and wind blinded the advance. Their rear guard fought from every rise. The greater part of the horses escaped to the north, and we hold only the ground we stand on. After Canyon Creek, the logic of the campaign tightened. Nelson Miles moved from Fort Keogh with orders to bar the way to the Medicine Line. Howard pushed up from the southwest with a column that had already traversed mountains and rivers. The Nimiipuu village, still coherent under leaders whose counsel ran through daily councils, aimed its line at the Milk River country and beyond it the invisible boundary. Nights came colder. Cartridge boxes grew lighter. The horses showed ribs and sweat lines stayed frosted at first light. Interpreters could still carry messages outward in the hope of terms, but every mile placed the village deeper into a channel between converging commands. Telegraph stations ticked in towns behind the lines, registering sightings requisitions and the cadence of war news. On the ground, the wire meant nothing within the sound of a horse breathing. The incidents together raised the stakes and narrowed choices. Clearwater showed that a pitched fight could not crush the moving camp. The Lolo Passage proved that barriers and small posts could not channel a determined migration with its own scouts and routes. Big Hole turned fear into resolve and put grief into the saddle. Camas Meadows demonstrated that a precise strike on logistics could bend the clock of pursuit. Yellowstone layered confusion over the map. Canyon Creek revealed that as long as the horse herd moved, the village moved. By the last weeks of September, the endgame was visible to commanders and elders alike. The line to Canada still drew north, but the country ahead was a web of low ridges and coulees where a column could strike hard and then sit, and where a village burdened by cold wounded and hunger might be forced to stop. In the last week of September 1877, the geography narrowed to the Bear Paw uplands. Colonel Nelson Miles marched north from Fort Keogh with a mixed command of mounted infantry and cavalry companies, a light field piece brought as far as the ground would allow, and allied scouts who knew the folds and water of the Milk River country. His written purpose was unambiguous: reach the moving Nimiipuu village before it crossed the Medicine Line and force its submission. General Oliver Howard advanced on a wide arc from the southwest with a column that had pursued since the Clearwater. The distance between the two United States forces was measured in hard days. The distance between the Nimiipuu village and Canada was measured in hours if unopposed. The march that delivered contact was ordinary in its parts and decisive in its timing. Miles pushed along open grass and low ridges, halting only long enough to feed animals and close stragglers. Scouts rode ahead to test for recent fire pits and to taste the water it draws. Couriers worked the back trail with notes for supply and for a signal to Howard. Night bivouacs were terse and cold. The command moved with cartridge boxes heavy and a clear image of a village close to safety. The rules of engagement framed by departmental correspondence, rather than a single order, were simple: intercept before the boundary, prevent dispersal, and if possible, seize the horse herd. There was also the customary instruction to avoid harm to non-combatants when practicable, a phrase that had to live inside coulees where bullets skipped off frozen dirt. On 1877, 0930 lead elements came over a rise and saw lodges strung along shallow ground near the headwaters of a small drainage. The first volleys fired at the horse herd and outer rings of shelter. Surprise and wind did the rest. Families ran toward low channels that offered cover from grazing fire. Riders tried to turn the horses into a tight mass and drive them out of reach. The first minute set the shape of the fight: a rapid compression, a charge blunted by ground, and return fire, then a tightening cordon. Among the Nimiipuu, Olakot was killed early. His loss was felt at once in the council ring and at the rifle pits. The village pulled inward and began to dig. The pits were shallow at first, then deeper as hands found roots in frost. Positions formed along slight rises that overlooked approaches and allowed short rushes from hole to hole. The defenders placed steady shots on any bright target, then lay still as wind swung curtains of snow across the line. Miles tried to keep the initiative with pressure on both flanks. Mounted men dismounted to fight on foot where the ground would not hold a charge. Infantry who had ridden to the field on mules and wagons moved forward with rifles and ammunition boxes. A small field piece was muscled into place to drop shells into draws where smoke and cries suggested movement. The effect was more moral than material, as the wind pushed smoke back and fuses burned fitfully. Ammunition expenditure rose. Couriers counted remaining cartridges per company and asked packers for more. Casualties accumulated in short bursts. The command pressed as doctrine taught and paid in blood for every dozen paces gained. Nelson, a Miles field order. Excerpt, near Bear Paw Mountains. 77-0930. Skirmish forward by rushes. Hold what you take. Keep the horses in view. Prevent escape to the north at any hazard. Inside the ring, Nimiipuu leaders kept the perimeter coherent. Men who had fought at Clearwater, Big Hole, and Canyon Creek understood how to place fire and when to risk a short rush to recover a fallen person or a sack of cartridges. Women and older boys carried water from a seep that formed in the draw and broke kindling with numb fingers. The number of wounded grew, and the small stores of cloth and medicine dwindled. Food was limited to what could be pulled from saddlebags and to animals that could be quickly butchered under fire. Nights were the worst. The cold cut through wet clothes and blankets, and the wind found every tear in a lodge skin repurposed as a screen. Yet the line held. Short counterfires kept the attackers from walking right up to the pits. In the dark, small parties tried to slip out toward the north. Some reached open country and later found Cree and Assiniboine communities near the line. Most did not risk the attempt with children or elders. On the second day, Howard's scouts signaled by smoke and then by rider that his column was within supporting distance. The presence of a second United States force, the Nonton, did not change the immediate geometry. It made the ring feel heavier to those inside. It increased the confidence of those outside that the village was now contained. Both commands coordinated by courier to avoid blue-on-blue fire in the broken ground. Reports rode back to depots with requests for bread, bacon, and blankets. The medical tents behind the United States line filled, and surgeons called for lint and spirits. Chaplains read softly over a few bodies before burial under frost-hard soil. Cartridge belts were reworked to accept any caliber available from the trains. The fight had become a siege governed by small logistics, by the endurance of cold and hunger, and by the precision of marksmen on both sides who shot at fleeting shapes in blowing snow. Oliver O. Howard, dispatch excerpt, near Bear Paw Mountains. 77-1002. I am in position southwest. Keep a steady cordon and do not waste men in rash assaults. Time and weather will work with us if we hold our lines. Casualty figures have been argued since. Contemporary returns for the United States list roughly 24 killed and several dozen wounded by the end of the siege. Later compilers shift the numbers by a handful either way. Nimiipuu losses are harder to fix because many dead were recovered inside the line, and some were carried away by those who escaped north. Credible ranges run to several dozen killed and larger numbers wounded relative to a smaller total in the pits. The ratio matters less in this context than the effect. Every loss within the village struck a kin line and removed a pair of hands from hauling water, cutting wood, or steadying a rifle. Fact versus folklore must be marked here. The common picture of a single grand charge and a climactic last stand does not match reports from both sides. The field was a series of rushes, crossfires, and low ground maneuvers interrupted by cold, by darkness, and by the need to eat and tend the wounded. It was a contest of persistence more than spectacle. Another point needs clarity. Joseph was a principal voice in council and a figure recognized by United States officers, but he was not the sole military commander. Looking Glass Whitebird and other headmen shaped decisions along with warriors who held specific sectors of the line. Later memory condensed leadership into one name because of the surrender words and the public tours that followed. The record shows a distributed defense shaped by council. On the third and fourth days, the pressure shifted again as ammunition within the pits ran low. Cartridge belts were cut down to share the last rounds with those best placed to use them. Strips of leather served as patches. Old muzzle loaders and captured pieces appeared where a man still had powder. The wind did not slacken. Firewood within reach had been pulled up and burned to coals. The seep that had offered water began to ice over at the edges. A few negotiators went out under makeshift flags to ask for time or for a path for non-combatants. In return, Miles asked for an unconditional laying down of arms and the surrender of leaders. Between parley and a rifle crack, the field drifted toward a decision. Through this period, small United States parties tried close assaults to seize ground that enfiladed pits or to pull down shelter screens. Some succeeded and then found themselves under accurate fire from a new angle. Others fell back, leaving men on the slope. A few scouts from allied nations moved among the United States skirmishers, showing where a wash might hide a file of men until the last 20 yards. The weather punished the brave and the unlucky without favor. Visibility opened and closed by the minute. Men on both sides fired at sounds that might have been an enemy or might have been a blanket snapping in a gust. On 1877-10-05, the sequence of parleys culminated. The combination of cold wounds and spent cartridge boxes inside the ring, coupled with the certainty that Howard's line could seal any breakout, convinced many that continuing the defense would mean more deaths without a path to the line for families. Looking Glass was killed near this time by a shot from concealment as he moved to shift men along the works. The death hit the remaining leaders hard. It removed a voice that had favored movement under cover whenever a crease in the ring appeared. Word ran through the pits that a talk would open with Miles. A translation of the words that passed was written that day by a United States officer with enough language to render sense for his command. The phrasing that traveled into later books drew its force from the plain inventory of cold hunger and loss. The exact words in Nimiipuu remain a subject for scholars and for families. The effect on the ground was immediate. Men laid rifles in small piles. Women gathered children and led them from holes like cellars back toward lodges that had been stripped of useful cloth and poles. United States soldiers stepped forward with caution and then with relief, and some offered blankets and food to those who came out first. Nelson, a Miles after-action note near Bear Paw Mountains. 77-10-05. The firing ceased at noon. Parties came in with white signals. Arms were surrendered as required. The camp is in distress from cold and want. Measures ordered to provide necessary subsistence. The humanitarian outcome in the first days after surrender was mixed. Rations were issued, but the numbers of sick and wounded exceeded what the field surgeons could treat with the stocks on hand. Transfers began under guard toward Fort Keogh and then to railheads. Litters jolted over frozen ground. Families were kept together where possible, but the administrative need to count and to move often overtook requests for time to bury dead or to find missing kin. In the United States, camps men wrote letters home about a hard enemy who had fought well. In the Nimiipuu camp, men and women tried to make sense of a march that had crossed mountains and geyser basins only to stop within sight of a line that might have meant safety. The battle on paper closed with dates and totals. On the ground, it closed with frost on churned sod and a silence broken only by wind over grass. By the evening of 1877-10-05, the siege phase had ended. The campaign that began with deadlines and agency notices had turned through rivers and parks into a ring of shallow pits on an upland in Montana. Its last act combined the logic of long pursuit with the physics of weather and supply. In that combination lay the reason the event is remembered not only for tactics, but for words. The march had brought a people to the edge of a boundary. The siege had taken from them the means to cross it together. The surrender gave the United States the operational result it sought and handed the country a sentence that entered public speech. The next phase would run not on ridges, but on rail lines and in ledgers, and it would last years. The turning point at Bear Paw unfolded across thin days when weather and arithmetic closed together. By the morning of 1877-10-04, the pits inside the Nimiipuu perimeter held more wounded than rifles that could still be steadied for long shots. Cartridge belts had been cut and retied so that the last rounds could be shared to sectors where approaches were shortest. The seep that had sustained the camp began to ice at the edges. Small children coughed from cold smoke and hunger. Looking Glass fell to a shot from concealment as he moved along the line to shift men where frost had softened the walls. His death stripped the defense of a leader whose counsel had favored motion and deception from the first days on the Clearwater. Outside the ring, the United States skirmish lines held ground that tightened the angle on any breakout. Nelson Miles knew that a sudden push might tear a gap, but he also knew that a failed assault would cost men he needed for the handover to escort duties after surrender. Oliver Howard's presence on the southwest shoulder made a joint pressure possible without risky massing in a single coulee. The choice for commanders was between one more rush or the slow attrition of cold and want. The choice inside the pits was between another day of fire that the wounded could not survive, or the risk that words would lead to separation and exile. In that difference of posture lay the pivot. On 1877, 10:05, the line went quiet twice in the morning for brief parleys. The first ended with men returning to holes and the crack of rifles resuming over the same low ground. The second drew longer and included a plain account of conditions inside the ring. The field note version in English, kept by a United States officer, captured the inventory of loss and the cold air that made each phrase a kind of frost. There is respectful debate over the exact phrasing in Nimiipuu and over the extent to which the officer shaped the text for his own superiors. What is not in dispute is that the words signaled a decision to stop the fight as a whole and to submit to custody with the expectation that non-combatants would be protected and the people would be allowed to live. The immediate effect was visible in small motions. Rifles were stacked in ragged piles. Women lifted children and led them away from pits. Men moved slowly with blankets over shoulders and hands open to show that the last cartridges had been spent or set aside. United States soldiers advanced by sections to make the first collections of arms and to guide people to ground where rations could be issued. The weather did not ease. Wind came in stiff gusts and found every torn edge of lodge skin repurposed as a shelter cloth. The line that had been a fight became a cordon for a humanitarian effort that exceeded the field stock of surgeons and quartermasters. The admission against interest that best fits this hour was written by the attacking commander. It recognized something about the defense that the arithmetic of returns could not show. Nelson A. Miles, after action statement. Near Bear Paw Mountains, 1877, 10:06. They fought with steadiness and skill under conditions that would have broken many troops. I bear witness that their courage and endurance were of a high order even while I record their surrender. The counterfactual that historians test begins with the proximity of the medicine line. If the village had broken the ring in strength on the first day and kept the herd together for a single forced night, march parties in good order might have reached allies over the boundary and avoided recapture for a season. If a relief of cartridges and food had arrived inside the perimeter before the second night, and if a snow squall had masked a flank, the defense might have traded space for time and slipped a corps northward. Yet these lines rest on stacked conditions. 2 United States columns had already converged. The horse herd had been partially dispersed. Frost drove men to fire that revealed positions. The edge of endurance had been crossed by the wounded in the pits and by families who had not eaten well since Canyon Creek. The map still held the idea of escape. The ground did not. The human cost must be placed in names where we have them. Olcott lay in the early ring of the fight. Looking Glass fell moving along the works. Other headmen and young fighters died in places that reports describe by distance and feature rather than by personal detail. Women and children were counted among the dead at Big Hole weeks earlier and among the wounded here. A winter count made later would mark Bear Paw, with signs for pit snow and the hand raised in speech rather than in war. The displacement path began at once. Under guard families were moved to the United States camps, then to Fort Keogh, then to railheads that led toward Fort Leavenworth and the Indian Territory. Litters held the worst hurt. A few who had slipped away in the dark reached the line and found shelter with communities to the north. Most followed the ledgers that would next define their days. The words that closed the fight became public property within weeks. Newspapers printed versions that emphasized the stark simplicity of the phrasing. School readers later included the closing sentence as a moral lesson. In this public use, the statement floated free of the administrative facts that followed and of the contest over translation that specialists continue to weigh. Inside Nimiipuu memory, the day has another register. It is a record of families who had to choose between staying together and sending riders north of elders who tried to speak for a future life rather than another morning of blood on frost and of a promise that protection would follow surrender. Synthesis returns us to the structural forces set in P2. The 1855 recognition and the 1863 reduction created a legal map that was then enforced by agents and soldiers as settlement accelerated. Railroad, telegraph, and pasture lines fixed corridors that columns could use and that civilians could measure in rumor and fear. Ration deadlines and arrest orders compressed time in spring 1877 until a local killing widened into a campaign. At Bear Paw, these abstractions became physical limits. Powder and food ran out. Weather set its own law. Commanders calculated risk and chose attrition over a rush. Leaders inside the ring weighed kin and chose survival over continued resistance. The turning point was therefore not single shout or charge, but a convergence of treaty history, logistics, climate, and human exhaustion. It is remembered because words spoken in that moment of convergence carried outward into a national vocabulary, while the people who spoke them entered years of captivity and partial return that would test the meaning of every promise made at the surrender. The first administrative acts followed within hours of the surrender. Under departmental instructions, the people were counted in rough groups wounded, were noted for immediate transport, and rifles and loose cartridges were gathered for shipment to depots. Wagons took those who could not walk to the nearest post roads. Escorts led columns of families toward Fort Keogh for temporary holding. The tone in the United States camps mixed relief with urgency. Surgeons asked for lint and quinine. Quartermasters asked for bread, bacon, coffee, and blankets. The weather stayed raw. These practical notes seeded the record that would define the next years. From Fort Keogh, the captives moved east by road and then by rail. Fort Leavenworth became the first long stop. The post returns and surgeon reports for late 1877 and early 1878 record sickness and deaths at a rate that alarmed officers and missionaries. Marshy ground and new climates brought fever. Agency correspondents wrote about milk and fresh meat and about the difficulty of housing large families with privacy and dignity inside military lines. In the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1878, the department set out the decision to relocate the group to the Indian Territory under the Quapaw Agency as a temporary measure, while policymakers debated a final home. The language was procedural. The effect on families was repeated separation from known country. The transfer south began in 1878 and continued into 1879. Quapaw Agency letter books and receipts list shipments of flour bacon, coffee cloth, and limited tools. They also carry the names of those assigned to sub-agencies and those who died in the first seasons. Missionary letters from the same period describe efforts to set up schoolrooms and to translate short prayers and lessons. The contrast between administrative neatness and lived conditions persists in the documents. Heat replaced frost. Malaria and dysentery took a toll. A few men found work cutting timber or hauling freight. Women sewed and nursed the sick. Elders struggled with a land that did not match the memory lines of Wallowa and the high trails. Through these months, petitions for return accumulated. Joseph traveled east under guard, and then with escorts who recognized the public interest his presence drew. In cities, he met officials, editors, and audiences who heard a calm account of the march and the plea to return to Wallowa. Newspapers printed his name alongside the famous surrender phrasing, the words that had closed the fight, were now used to frame a request for policy change. The War Department papers for 1879 and 1880 preserve correspondence between field posts and Washington about the costs of continuing to hold the people in a far climate. The annual reports of 1880 through 1883 track disease counts and the slow improvement in housing and rations. They also record the steady pressure from church figures and reform associations for a humane resolution. A partial return was authorized in the mid-1880s. In 1885 and 1886, groups were allowed to leave the Indian Territory and travel to the Northwest. Assignments split the community. Some went to Lapwai in present-day Idaho, where they joined relatives on the reservation and entered roles that defined ration rights and school placements. Joseph and many of the Wallowa band were not permitted to resettle their valley. They were assigned to the Colville Reservation in present-day Washington, a land of different rivers and hills. This decision appears in Interior Department correspondence and in Colville agency records that list family names, housing issues, and wage work under agency permits. The split mattered for kin networks and for language practices because travel between the two places demanded time and permission. Land and resource dispositions in Wallowa, meanwhile, proceeded under state and federal law. Survey plats turned into patents. Grazing leases and timber contracts were recorded in county books. Rail spurs touched markets on the far side of the mountains. The practical effect was to lock in a non-Nimiipuu economy in the valley by the time return petitions had ripened. Local newspapers carried notices of land sales where ancestral meadows had been described in earlier Treaty Council talk. The question that had seemed open on maps in the 1860s had been closed on the ground by the 1880s. Demography and health across these years can be read in the ledgers of Fort Leavenworth, Quapaw, and later Lapwai and Colville. Births and deaths were entered in narrow columns. Surgeon monthly reports note fevers in summer and respiratory cases in winter. Rations shifted with budgets. Fresh beef and flour alternated with poorer issues when contracts lagged. School registers list attendance and absences and the small punishments of the era for speaking native languages in class. Yet, continuance threads through the same lines. Sunday gatherings carried song. Family stories fixed geography and words when feet could not return there. Men hired as scouts or farmhands brought cash to households that still tried to time planting and harvest to older knowledge of seasons. Cultural persistence took forms that the official papers only glimpse. Winter count style notations and later ledger art recorded the long flight and the pits at Bear Paw as shapes and marks that do not depend on alphabet. Beadwork and dresses at feast days kept designs that carry valley and river stories. In the early 20th century, veterans of the 1877 campaign from the United States side visited commemorations and shook hands with men they had fought. Local historical societies printed pamphlets with photographs of Bear Paw ground lines. The National Park Service later marked Bear Paw Battlefield as a preserved site within a larger effort to interpret the 1877 campaign across multiple states. Park waysides set out distances and dates. Descendants walked the field and read texts that tried to hold grief and respect in balance. The written record for these developments lies in several steady sources. The annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1877 to 1886 trace policy decisions on removal, exile, and partial return and list ration issues. School openings and medical conditions by agency. The War Department annual reports and the printed correspondence of field commands set the framework for the arrest and pursuit in 1877, and then recede as Interior took over. The after-action report of Nelson Miles and the dispatches of Oliver Howard give the military view of Bear Paw. The field notes and later published text by Charles Erskine Scott Wood preserve the surrender phrasing that entered public memory. Agency letterbooks at Quapaw and Colville record daily realities that made policy tangible. Together, these references show continuity more than drama. Present-day continuance rests on institutions built and defended over generations. The Nez Perce tribe in Idaho maintains programs in language education, fisheries, and cultural preservation, and engages in legal work on water rights and resource management. Descendants who live on the Colville Reservation in Washington hold ceremonies and teach children the names of places their great-grandparents could not revisit. Bear Paw in Montana is a place of annual remembrance. Schools teach the 1877 story with more precision than in earlier decades, noting that the surrender words traveled through a translator and through newspapers before they reached textbooks. Visitors stand in wind that still comes hard across low ridges and reads plaques that place dates and names in measured lines. Through all of this, the voice of policy never matches the voice of families. The papers say transfer assignment and issue. The families say we stayed together here and we lost someone there. The papers say return authorized. The families say we came back to a different place and made a life anyway. That difference shapes the memory of Bear Paw. It also explains why the episode sits at a hinge between war reports and community calendars. The legal story runs from treaty pages to annual reports to park management plans. The human story runs from council fires to a ring of shallow pits to schoolrooms where children recite dates and then go home to hear a winter story that holds the same dates in another order. By the end of the 19th century, the immediate exile was over, but the structural decisions of the 1860s and 1870s were still inscribed in land titles and agency boundaries. In the 20th and 21st centuries, legal cases and cultural programs carved out new forms of presence and care. The people continue. The places where the 1877 march passed still hold tracks if you know how to read layered ground. And the field at Bear Paw remains quiet and open, a site where words and weather resolved a campaign and began an exile, and where descendants now speak for both endurance and return. Across a century and a half, the record of 1877 yields a broad consensus and a few sharp debates. Most scholars agree that the Nimiipuu flight and the siege at Bear Paw exposed the collision between treaty language and settler expansion, and that the campaign displayed exceptional tactical discipline by a village protecting families under pursuit. Bear Paw also stands as a study in logistics and weather, where cold hunger distance and ammunition attrition decided outcomes as much as commanders did. The surrender phrasing attributed to Joseph moved quickly into public speech and later into school readers, giving the episode a symbolic power larger than any single engagement on the trail. Contested points remain. Exact casualty totals vary across returns and later compilations, with ranges rather than fixed numbers for losses inside the Nimiipuu line. The wording, translation, and intent of the surrender statement are debated in detail since the English text passed through an officer intermediary and later circulation. Leadership is sometimes simplified in public memory around one figure, yet the sources show distributed decision-making among Joseph Looking-Glass Whitebird and other headmen within daily councils. Strategy assessments differ on whether a breakout to the medicine line remained feasible after first contact. Some argue that a coordinated night move with intact horse herds could have carried more families into Canada. Others point to converging United States columns, exhausted mounts, cold weather, and failing ammunition as decisive constraints by the second day. The enduring legacy runs on two tracks. In military studies, the 1877 campaign survives as a case on long pursuit against a mobile community, on the protection and targeting of horse herds, and on siege dynamics in low, broken ground under early winter. In civic culture, the closing words at Bear Paw became a moral shorthand for exhaustion and for witness. That symbolic life sometimes obscured the administrative years that followed, including captivity at Fort Leavenworth, exile in the Indian Territory, partial returns in the 1880s, and the assignment of many Wallowa people to Colville rather than to their valley. Recent interpretation works to keep both tracks in view and to acknowledge present-day continuance in Idaho and Washington as central, not as an epilogue. Fact and folklore are best separated by steady notes. There was no single grand charge that decided the field. The siege was a chain of rushes and counterfires under wind and snow. Joseph was a principal voice and a public face, not the sole battlefield commander. The surrender statement is powerful, yet it is a mediated text that should be read alongside agency ledgers, petitions, and family accounts. The event endures because a precise date and place in the Bear Paw uplands joined a long treaty history to a voice that entered public language, while the people who spoke it rebuilt life in new geographies. The words traveled far, but the people remained central. Whose role has public memory reduced Joseph Looking-Glass Whitebird or the wider Nimiipuu community? What is your view on the translation debate? Join the discussion in the comments. Thank you for staying to the end.